Imagine that one day you're out taking a walk and you come across a child drowning in a pond. Now, there's nobody else around, and the only person who can run in and save her is you. The only catch is that if you run in, you will surely destroy your brand new shoes. You don't have time to take off your shoes. It's basically either you jump in and save her, ruining your shoes, or you stand idly by while she drowns. Now, clearly, rushing in to save her would be a nice thing to do. But it's a lot more than that. It's not just a nice thing to do, it's a moral obligation. What this means is that if you don't do it, if you just stand idly by while she drowns, you're doing something wrong. So, what principle could explain and justify this judgment that you're doing something morally wrong if you don't rush in and save her? In Famine, Affluence, and Morality, Peter Singer offers the following principle. If it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything morally significant, we ought morally to do it. Now, one nice thing about this principle is that you don't have to be a utilitarian or a Kantian or a virtue ethicist or a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or anybody from any particular group in order to accept it. This is a widely plausible principle, and that's a good thing, because we want people to be going and saving children if they come across them in ponds like this. So it makes sense to appeal to a principle that's going to be accessible to pretty much everybody. Now, it might seem like a principle like that is a really innocuous, not very powerful principle, but when you explore its implications, what you find is that it's actually quite drastic in terms of the recommendation that it's going to make for how we should change our lives. So to explore these implications, let's take a look at it in an argument. Premise 1. Suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. Premise 2. If it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything morally significant, we ought morally to do it. Premise 3. We can prevent suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care without thereby sacrificing anything morally significant. Therefore, we should prevent suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care. So the argument's valid. To see whether it's sound, let's look at the premises. So premise 1 needs no defense. Obviously, death and suffering from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad things. Premise 3 needs a little bit of defense, but it's quite easy to defend when we just look at the various charities that are out there. So one of my favorite charities is called the Against Malaria Foundation. And what they do is they give long-lasting insecticide-treated bed nets to people in parts of the world where malaria is a real problem. Malaria accounts for around 400,000 deaths, a little more than 400,000 deaths a year. And a lot of people who die from that are children. So for around $4, a little over $4, that you give to the Against Malaria Foundation, they can send one of these long-lasting insecticide-treated bed nets to somebody in Malawi. And there's a good chance that that could prevent somebody from contracting malaria and even dying from malaria. So the nice thing about the Against Malaria Foundation is that they're incredibly transparent. So it's not like some charities where you're not really sure where the money is going, and a lot of it's being spent on what seems like a bloated overhead budget. The nice thing about the Against Malaria Foundation is that that's not the case. So this isn't meant to be an advertisement for AMF. There's lots of other charities that fit these criteria as well. But the point is that premise 3 is true. We are actually in a position right now to be able to protect people from suffering and dying due to the effects of malaria for not very much money. So it appears as though this argument is sound. Let's explore some of its implications. Imagine that you want a coffee and a bagel. Now you could either stay home and eat a bagel and drink a coffee that you have there, that you could make there, or you can go to a coffee shop and buy a coffee, buy a bagel, and drink and eat that there. Now, when we think about the costs of making a bagel and coffee at home versus the cost of buying a bagel and a coffee at a coffee shop, also driving to the coffee shop, and any other costs that might be associated with the whole endeavor, you'll see that it's a lot cheaper to stay home and do the coffee and the bagel there. When I think about my experience going to coffee shops, I would estimate kind of conservatively that I would save about $5 by staying home. Now, here's the thing. Should I go out to the coffee shop? Or should I save that money and give it to the Against Malaria Foundation? Well, it's clear that it would be a nice thing to do to give the money to the Against Malaria Foundation. But if we take this argument seriously, the conclusion is actually that we're morally obligated to do it. Because you are able to help save somebody from suffering and death due to malaria by giving the money to the Against Malaria Foundation, sending a long-lasting insecticide-treated Bennet over to them, as opposed to just keeping the money for yourself and buying the coffee and the bagel at the coffee shop. And although there could be some circumstances where foregoing the coffee shop coffee and bagel and doing it at home involves a morally significant sacrifice, like, for example, if you're meeting somebody there for a really important business deal, in a lot of cases, there's no morally significant sacrifice involved. It's just kind of, you're going to do your work at home rather than at the coffee shop for an afternoon. And so what the conclusion of this argument means for you in your life, or me in my life, is that instead of going to the coffee shop and buying the bagel and the coffee there, I should save my money and give it to the Against Malaria Foundation instead. Now, before we go on, I just want to mention a couple of caveats. So, first of all, we're not saying that it would be nice to donate the money. We're saying that you're morally obligated to do it. Second of all, the second caveat is that we're not talking at all about the government compelling or forcing somebody to donate money. That is not what's at issue. We're talking about whether or not you ought to donate, not whether it is permissible for a third party to compel or force you to do it. And it's perfectly consistent to think that you ought to donate, but also that it would be wrong for a government to force you to do it. So if the objection you're thinking about raising against this argument is that it's wrong for governments to force people to donate, stop and review, because you have badly misunderstood what is going on here. So suppose you want to reject this surprising implication of this argument. Well, we're not going to be able to reject premise 1, and we're not going to be able to reject premise 3. So our best bet is to critique premise 2. So how can we do that? Well, one thing we could do is we could say, in the case of the child in Malawi, they're from a different country than me. And maybe my moral obligations only extend to those who are citizens of my country. So you might think that we do have an obligation to save people from suffering and death due to famine and poverty and all sorts of other things, but only if they're citizens of our country. So let's test that principle. What we have is basically a revised version of premise 2. Let's test it. So imagine that you come across the pond and there's the child drowning in it. Only you can save the child. You have the shoes on. And you look down and you see that they have a Malawian passport. So the child is a citizen of Malawi and not the United States. Does that really make a difference? Are you really prepared to say that all of a sudden you no longer have an obligation to save that child simply because of the country of the child's birth? Clearly not. It's clearly not the case that we only have moral obligations to those who are citizens of our own country. And so we have to reject this revised premise, and we haven't yet seen a reason to reject the conclusion, because we haven't seen a reason yet to reject the second premise. Okay, so this first attempt to rebut premise 2 failed. Let's look at another one. So imagine that somebody says to you, well, the child in Malawi is really far away, hundreds of miles away, thousands of miles away, so you don't have to save her. Well, what we have now is another candidate for a revised version of premise 2, and the candidate goes something like this. If you could save somebody from suffering or death due to poverty, famine, or lack of shelter, and they're near to you, then you have to do it. But if they're not near to you, then you don't have to do it. So let's examine this. Imagine that the child is drowning in the pond, but they're too far away from you to actually see them. And the way that you would have to save them is to walk onto a muddy floor, so you'd ruin your shoes, and act as a control panel to a crane, and then operate the crane and pull the child out of the pond. Is it really okay to suddenly just, stand there idly by, and watch the child drown because you don't want to operate the crane and get your shoes dirty because now the child is really far away? Clearly not. it's clearly not the case that distance completely removes your moral obligations to this child. All right, so this second attempt to rebut premise 2 failed as well. Let's consider one more. So imagine that somebody says to you, there's lots of other people who could save this child from Malawi, and they're not doing it. So why should I have to do it? And again, we have a final revised version of premise 2, and it goes something like this. If you could save somebody from suffering or death due to lack of food, shelter, medical care, or poverty, or whatever else, then you should do it as long as there's nobody else who could do it. So imagine that we go back to the pond. There's a child's drowning in the pond. There's lots of people sitting around the pond and nobody's running in to save her. Is it really okay all of a sudden for you to just stand there idly by while the child dies simply because there's others out there who could have saved her who are not doing it? I think the answer still is clearly and decidedly no, it's not okay. You're still doing something wrong by not saving the child. Now, the fact that other people are not intervening might make it more likely that you're not going to intervene. So what you might have is a psychological explanation for your lack of intervention. But a psychological explanation is not a moral justification. Psychological explanation tells us what you're likely to do. It doesn't tell us anything about what you ought to do, because we often do the wrong things. And when we do the wrong things, there's always some psychological explanation for why we did that. So I could go on forever and give lots of different possible rebuttals to premise 2 and then give lots of responses to those. But the basic point I want to make is that Peter Singer in this paper, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, has given us a general tactic that you can deploy again and again and again to any objection that gets raised. And the general tactic goes something like this. Come up with a reason why you don't have an obligation to save somebody's life or to protect them from some serious harm while making only a morally significant sacrifice. So, for example, you come up with a reason why you don't have an obligation to donate the $5 to the Against Malaria Foundation as opposed to spending it on coffee and a bagel for yourself. Then redescribe the drowning child thought experiment so that your reason applies to it as well. So, for example, if your reason was that you can't see the child in Malawi, then describe the drowning child thought experiment so that, you've been temporarily blinded by a very bright light, so you can't actually see the child who you're going to save. Third step is to ask yourself whether you still have an obligation to save the child. And if the answer is yes, then you have just rebutted that potential counter-argument against the second premise. If the answer is no, then you've succeeded in undermining the second premise. Now, I want to close this video by talking about one final thing that Peter Singer brings up in his article, Famine, Affluence, and Morality. And it's this objection that he is giving us a very drastic revision of our moral principles. Like, we typically refer to something called supererogation when we talk about charitable giving. A supererogatory act is an action that it is nice to do, but where you haven't done anything wrong if you don't do it. And Singer is challenging the ways that we draw the boundaries of supererogation. He's not saying that there can't be supererogation. That the article is open to the possibility that there's some things that are supererogatory. But what he is saying is that charitable giving, when charitable giving involves making a morally insignificant sacrifice on my part to prevent something very bad from happening to somebody else, then that's not supererogatory, that's a moral obligation. And the response that I want to offer to that potential counter-argument is that we shouldn't think that all ethical theory is supposed to do is to just reaffirm all of our existing commitments. One thing that ethical theory can help us do is to re-examine them and to see whether they withstand scrutiny. And I think that what this drowning child thought experiment does is it shows us that even from our own perspectives, from our own intuitions about this thought experiment, we see that a duty to help others through insignificant sacrifices isn't something that we're comfortable saying is just a supererogatory act. It's a moral obligation.